Good morning, everyone. I'm Christine Sonia. I'm the Nova Scotia Director for the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And what we thought we'd do this morning is I'm just going to introduce the authors of the report and our other guest speaker this morning. And then we will begin with a presentation of the key findings and key recommendations in the report, with both authors presenting those together. And then we've asked for a respondent. So this morning we are joined by author Alexandra Dobrowolski. She is a professor of political science here at St. Mary's. She is also a research associate with the CCPANS and serves as actually the chair of our research advisory committee. She works on issues related to representation, citizenship, social and immigration policy. She also co-led the Gender, Migration and Diversity Immigrant Women Research domain of the former Atlantic Metropolis Center. The other author is Howard Ramos. Howard is an associate professor of sociology at Dalhousie University, also a research associate with CCPANS. His work focuses on immigration, Aboriginal politics, equity, and social justice. He is author with Karen Stanbridge of Seeing Politics Differently. We also have joining us this morning Nabiha Atala. She is the manager of communications and outreach with the Immigrant Settlement and Integration Services. Nabiha is a first-generation immigrant. She's been working in this sector for 20 years, including in Vancouver, Winnipeg, and now here in Halifax. So this report, as you know, is on immigration, and its focus is specifically on what our province can do around immigration. This is not a report addressed to federal immigration. That would be an entirely different report. But there is lots that our government can be doing. And I'm going to turn it over to Alexandra Dobrowolski, who's going to kick us off with the research, beginning with the research findings.
So hi everyone and welcome. I'd like to start by thanking Christine, the Director for the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Nova Scotia, for all her work around the report and for organizing the press conference. And I'd like to thank Nabiha for agreeing to take part and for providing all the invaluable insights I know she'll provide. So I'd also like to thank all of you for coming as well. Between us, Howard and I, we have researched and written on public policy and immigration in Canada and Atlantic Canada, Nova Scotia for over 30 years. And as you all know in this room, the region is currently at a crossroads. We're facing a demographic car crash, if you will, a halting stop-start economy, and increasingly immigration is seen as the solution to both issues. In our view, the PNP program is an important engine when it comes to these matters, and Nova Scotia doesn't necessarily have to tailgate the federal government. It can take the driver's seat, and we can go down our own road. Vroom, vroom. So again, in this background, in this context, we consider the time to be ripe for some solid research to assess the opportunities and constraints of immigration, past, present, and future in Nova Scotia. And in so doing, we've come to the conclusion that Nova Scotia needs a creative policy approach to immigration. It needs an approach that goes beyond mimicking the economic-focused models of the federal government and other provinces. This means being proactive, not reactive when it comes to immigration. And unfortunately, we've seen a lot of reactive responses of late to immigration challenges in this country and in this province. So being proactive means saying yes to evidence-based research, long-term thinking, sustained commitments and investments, balancing the social with the economic, and making lasting inroads for immigrants and for all Nova Scotians. It's basically saying no to the quick fixes, the short-term thinking, the following the well-worn path of the federal and provincial government, and to the unidimensional immigration policies that we have called econocentric models. So to clarify what we mean by econocentric immigration models are models that are epitomized by a narrow, instrumental, short-term approach. To date, the province has largely fallen into step with other governments by banking on the purported benefits of economic migrants and using economic calculations to construct its immigration policies. With such policy, immigrants are expected to do all the giving while the province does most of the taking. To be sure, there have been some gains when it comes to immigration to this province. This economic immigration model has increased the number of immigrants coming and staying in Nova Scotia. Over half of new immigrants left the province a couple decades ago, and now almost 70% remain. This economic approach also expanded temporary migration, attracting temporary foreign workers and international students, filling acute labor needs and bolstering financially strapped universities. We argue, however, that economically driven immigration policies are counterproductive for Nova Scotia in the long term. Put simply, econocentric policies haven't really worked all that well. Let me briefly point out why they don't work. So basically, Nova Scotia is racing after the same ideal immigrants sought after by the rest of Canada. These immigrants are least likely to stay given the particular context of Nova Scotia. We have a vulnerable economy, we have a sparse, less and diverse population, we have a down-home mentality. And from a national vantage point, only 1% of all immigrants to Canada land in Nova Scotia. Between 20 to 37% do not stay. In terms of some of the programs we've adopted, the Nova Scotia nominee program, we had a failed economic stream experiment, which came at a huge financial cost to the government and even greater cost, economic and emotional, for the nominees in question. With the temporary foreign workers, we've seen a huge growth with a lot of short-term gain and questionable long-term results. We've had a lot of media coverage in relation to the various abuses that have recently occurred and a lot of backlash. In terms of international students, they're mobilizing, challenging their treatment as cash cows. And in all categories with respect to the permanent migrants, the Nova Scotia nominees, and the temporary foreign workers and international students, there are gender imbalances, there's racialized and ethnic streaming, which I'll return to in a moment. And if we look at the numbers, although the numbers of immigrants to the province have increased, the share of immigrants coming to Nova Scotia has not, and retention rates remain the worst in the country. And here we have a few graphs that Howard will examine and discuss for your perusal.
So the data that I'm presenting comes from Citizenship and Immigration Canada's facts and figures. The first graph I'm showing is a graph of immigration trends for Canadian provinces from 2003 to 2012. And usually when people talk about provincial nominee programs, they talk about sort of the story you can see in this graph, which is in 2003, most of the immigrants coming to Canada came to Ontario, that yellow line, and over time it's decreased and spread to a more even share across provinces. If you look at that graph, though, you also see some increase, that Quebec and Alberta, the blue line and the green line, are partly accounting for some of that change in migration. However, if you ask yourself, well, what's going on in the Atlantic provinces? This line graph doesn't help us very much. You'd have to squint. All four Atlantic provinces are scrunched together down here at the very, very bottom. No Atlantic province currently gets more than 1% of immigrants to Canada. So to look at Atlantic Canada, what you need to do is you need to take a microscope. And so I'll show you our microscope. These are the immigration patterns in Atlantic Canada as a share of permanent residents to the country. What's very important to notice on this graphic is the scaling. The scaling goes from 0% to 1.2%. That's not a whole lot of people coming to Atlantic Canada as a share. You'll see that there are some fluctuations. There were definitely an increase when different provincial nominee programs came into effect, but there are also decreases as different streams have shut down. What's important for Nova Scotia, which is the top line, is that before the provincial nominee program, or actually just when it was launched, Nova Scotia got about 0.7% of immigrants. After a history of the PNP program, we currently only get about 0.9% of immigrants to Nova Scotia. So the policies that we've brought about really haven't changed the share of immigrants coming to Nova Scotia. If we look at the numbers not as a percentage of the share, but we look at the number of permanent residents coming to Nova Scotia, we see that most people that come to Nova Scotia come under the economic stream of immigrants, which you see with the green line. We also see that people come as family-sponsored immigrants, in the top blue line. And we see that Nova Scotia has a commitment to accepting refugees as well, shown in the purple line. What's important to note here is that in 2003, the differences between those lines wasn't so big, that it was a much more balanced approach to immigration. If you look at 2011, after the PNP program came into effect in a main form, we see that there's a huge change, that the focus of immigration has largely become an economic focus at the cost of other potential streams of immigrants coming to Nova Scotia. With respect to the PNP, that's considered part of the economic stream, and I'm going to plot the PNP numbers here in red. And what you can see is that the provincial nominees are making up almost half of the economic migrants coming to Nova Scotia. But if I stop here, that would only be part of the story. Because the real story is not actually about permanent migration. The story is about temporary migration. When you plot temporary migration with the blue and the orange line, you see that by and far, temporary migration to Nova Scotia overshadows permanent migration to Nova Scotia. That in fact, it almost doubles the amount of permanent migrants coming to Nova Scotia. And this is something that we think is important to look at, because these are pools of people who could potentially be permanent migrants if we think about investing in the long term rather than the short term. Because temporary migrants certainly bolster the economy. They certainly fill acute jobs. They're great for the universities, but we need to ask ourselves, do they solve the problem of the long term, which is avoiding that demographic car crash? Alexandra.
Thanks, Albert. So our report details these and other limitations that come with econocentric policies. Overall, they place the focus on the bottom line over immigrants' well-being. Many immigrants are underemployed, working in job sectors beneath their level of education and training. There are few social supports. Econocentric policies contribute to tensions over employment and wages in a tight labor market, as seen with recent controversies over temporary foreign workers, especially when temporary migration has expanded so much that it now rivals permanent immigration, as Howard recounted. The prevailing econocentric approach fails to grapple with the province's complex economic, social, and cultural realities. And so, to succeed on the immigration front, Nova Scotia needs to accept these realities and must incorporate other dimensions of life into its immigration policies. This will distinguish it from the pack. Nova Scotia has to think beyond the economic to consider what gives the province an advantage and where it has the most to offer. It needs to look to areas that the federal government and other provinces overlook. It has to think creatively and innovatively around immigration. For a start, this means committing to and investing in immigration, providing more resources to the Office of Immigration, using these resources to provide realistic information to potential immigrants, generating comprehensive and accessible data and evaluative mechanisms to be used by immigration officers and settlement organizations, researchers, and schools, to liaise better with settlement organizations, employers, and universities, to invest in promoting the value and importance of immigrants to Nova Scotia, especially in rural areas. Creative policies also recognize that investors and skilled immigrants are only a small slice of potential immigrants, and they are least likely to stay in communities with sluggish economies. Therefore, creative policies consider dipping into a deeper pool of immigrants and widening immigration streams. It means recognizing that the key criteria thus far are capital and human capital, money and education. And if you're going to focus on capital and human capital, you're going to have gender imbalances. So for example, when it comes to the nominee program, principal applicants are disproportionately male. Fewer women enter economic or entrepreneurial streams, given the simple fact that women around the world don't have the same financial and educational resources that men do. In contrast, more women enter familial streams, which means they are more likely to assume greater family-related responsibilities and to experience labor disruptions. And so we need to work towards gender parity when it comes to female principal applicants and recognize the gendered and racialized streaming that goes on. So for example, some research is uncovering in, with even successful nominee programs in Manitoba that, Filipina female nannies and nurses are targeted for certain streams, whereas Chinese and other South Asian investors are, male investors are targeted for entrepreneurial streams. In addition, creative policies mean attracting extended family members as they can open up immigration pathways that are currently less available elsewhere. And it reduces the desire and need to return to migrants' home countries and can provide important social supports for immigrants, women and men. Creative policies include converting temporary migrants, workers, and students to permanent immigrants, and should also involve attracting immigrants' extended families to create immigration chains that would end in Nova Scotia. Creative policies recognize the value of turning to alternate source countries for immigrants, ones that are not currently well represented in the present immigration system. In addition to attracting immigrants from Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, innovative policies would tap into other Atlantic countries, including Brazil, an emerging economic juggernaut, or the African countries, which are now the fastest growing economies in the world. Beyond attracting a wider range of immigrants, this has the potential to enhance Nova Scotia's place in the Atlantic region more broadly. In the final analysis, innovative policies recognize the sacrifices immigrants make coming to Nova Scotia. Creative policies are ones that invest in people and programs for immigrants and current Nova Scotians. We make clear that creative policies do not ignore the economic, instead they add the currently overlooked social and cultural dimensions. And this generates a more balanced approach to immigration, one that will truly make for more winners and less losers for the government and for all people of Nova Scotia. And now I'd like to ask Nabitha to provide her contribution. Thank you. Oh, do you want me to do? I can do that. Why don't I?
Good morning. Well, speaking on behalf of ISIS, Immigrant Settlement and Integration Services, we're very glad to see the release of this report and the call for expanding the vision. We definitely believe that that is a need for Nova Scotia right now. I'd like to make 3 points. Immigration is a positive force, immigration is a long-term process, and immigration is a shared responsibility. Now more than ever, we need to affirm that immigration is a positive force. Immigrants who stay in Nova Scotia contribute in many, many ways, both to the economic and the social growth of our province. And just to give you a couple of examples, Dr. Loshaj in Truro is a family physician. She's rated by her patients, by a large number of patients, for a total of 4.94 out of 5. This is quite extraordinary if you rate your doctor's websites. And here are some of the comments. Best doctor I've ever had. Superb bedside manner. Very decisive and intelligent. She's an amazing doctor. Excuse me. She's great with children. So glad that I have the chance to take my children to her. I have never been taken care and well attended to by a doctor like her. She was wonderful. Truro could use a few more like her. Dr. Loshaj and her family came to Canada as refugees from Kosovo. In a narrow, econocentric model, they would not have been able to come. We sometimes forget that people who come through different streams also contribute economically, socially, culturally. John Eiking Sr., a member of the Atlantic Agricultural Hall of Fame, he and his wife, along with their 10 children, have built a large commercial farm enterprise in Cape Breton with 80,000 laying hens, pullet operation, 50 head of beef cattle, strawberries, approximately 200 acres of vegetables, 1 acre of hydroponics vegetable greenhouse, and a sheep farm with 150 ewes. Mr. Eiking immigrated to Canada in the 1950s, before these current categories were in place. I'm not sure if he would make it right now under an economic immigration stream. And you may have heard of his son, Mark, who is the Member of Parliament for Victoria, Sydney. So these are just 2 of many examples of immigrants who have contributed significantly to the growth of Nova Scotia. We need to remember that in immigration, we're planting acorns, not harvesting spring wheat. Immigration is a long-term process, not only for filling jobs, but for building our province and our nation. Immigration requires investment. It requires investment by the government, but also by the community. Immigrants themselves are investing their whole lives when they pull up roots and come to Canada. But immigration is a shared responsibility, and it's an issue of the heart. People will only come and stay if they can make personal contacts, build networks. Of course, they need economic opportunities. They can create some of those economic opportunities. Many of them create economic opportunities not only for themselves, but for hundreds and thousands of Nova Scotians. And many of those who have created those economic opportunities did not come in through narrow economic immigration streams. When we try to develop immigration selection streams that are really focused, we end up losing some great potential. It's not an easy thing to do, but it is worth the effort to expand our vision and to be committed. And it also is really important to remember that immigration issues are complex, multi-layered, and require a multi-stakeholder approach. We have to collaborate. It's not just a government issue. It's government, community groups, ethnic communities themselves. All of us have a stake in immigration. Yes, it's crucial for Nova Scotia to expand the vision of immigration. It will not be easy. The government of Canada right now has definitely got a predominantly econocentric model, and all the provinces are facing challenges because of this model, especially the smaller provinces like ours. The government of Nova Scotia has a challenging task ahead of it. But I believe that by working collaboratively, not only with stakeholders within the province, but with other provinces across the country, that we can develop some creative, new, and expanded approaches to immigration. And basically, we don't have an option. We've all heard the warnings of the One Nova Scotia report. It's now or never. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. We are open for questions from the floor for a bit, and then if you want to do one-on-one interviews, we'll do that. But if there's any questions, we're certainly open.
I guess I'll start. Thank you very much for presenting it. Let's say that first, very interesting. Just a couple of comments, I guess, on behalf of the Office of Immigration. As we all know, we work quite closely with Citizenship and Immigration Canada on our immigration file, and we have only control over our PNP program at the moment, obviously, and since the inception of our nominee program, we have had increased numbers to our province, we're happy to say. And over the last several years, we've been constantly negotiating with the federal government to see increases in our nominee program. And again, happy to say that over the past few years, we have seen, dramatic increases where for several years we've had a cap of 500 nominees, and we've worked our way up to the point of 750 in some years, and this year again. So we're constantly fighting that uphill battle, constantly looking for evidence and research to back up our business case. Reports like this one and the One Nova Scotia report definitely validates that need, and a lot of times we're constantly looking for that evidence, looking for that research, and sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not there, and we still have to voice our concerns and continue to negotiate. So that's an ongoing process. But in the end of the day, the way that this program is structured, we are a part of the economic program. And I'm not saying that's, I'm not here to say that's right or wrong, but our position is that we are a part of the economic program. And the other streams, refugees and family and whatnot, the province doesn't particularly play at this point an active role in that because that's outside of our agreement and that's outside of our jurisdiction. So that's something we struggle with, obviously, in the broader context. The other piece as well is Immigration Canada as a whole, working with the provinces, they're moving towards a 70-30% model with immigration, 70% being economic and 30% being non-economic. And over the next several years, they'd like to see provinces move towards a 70-30 model. And Nova Scotia has always been in that range over the last several years in general. And a third of our, all of our immigrants to Nova Scotia, a third of them come from the nominee program. So we're not heavily reliant like some provinces like Manitoba or others where everybody's coming out of their PNPs and maybe not so many are choosing those provinces from federal streams, but we're lucky that we have a nice balance. So we are getting the family streams, we are getting the refugees to the province, and we always increase our commitment to those folks. And then of course we have a third coming through our own program. So if it's something that gets taken away, we're not, going up the stream with that. So we have a nice balance, and over this last several years, we've naturally had that 70-30 split. So we seem to be on mark with that. And the third point is with our temporary foreign workers moving into permanent residency, a lot of our nominees tend to be what we call flips. So flipping from coming here as a temporary person and then looking into a long-term avenue for permanent residency. So I definitely hear what you're saying with the cultural and the social aspects, and what I heard very strongly as well out of the IVNE report was not only the need to ramp up our numbers, but the need for our province to be a more welcoming province as well. And you named some really interesting source countries that we should be looking at, not just the Philippines, India, China, and those big ones, but really, putting more effort in the marketing parts of our program and seeing where we can tap into maybe untapped areas. The other piece of that coin, of course, is having a welcoming environment for them. I guess one of my questions would be, you talk a lot about how maybe we should be more innovative and whatnot, but just given the context I've just described where we tend to be, a little piece within the economic stream, what are some examples or suggestions based on your presentation specifically that you may want to share that I could maybe share onward?
Well, I think that the important thing to recognize is that there used to be more categories under the provincial nominee program. And that you're completely right. That is the only element that the province has any say in the current configuration. And so what we recommend is to try and ask, what can be broadened out in that program? What worked in the past and what could be changed in the future? So one of the recommendations we offer is to create a Nova Scotia experience stream. And a Nova Scotia experience stream helps make some of those transitions, but it could make a broader sense of transitions. So recently in the news, we hear a lot about Chen King, or Chen Ching, St. Mary's University's Mattress King. And he wants to immigrate to Canada. Under the current streams, he's not going to be able to immigrate because he has a business, but he doesn't have job experience with another business. Something innovative that the province could do is create a Nova Scotia experience stream that recognizes the time spent in universities as equivalent to having worked for another company. This is the kind of thing that isn't incongruent with an economic stream, but it's one that thinks innovatively and thinks about the long term rather than the short term. And so these are the kind of things that we think are important to be able to advocate. Nova Scotia experience stream could also look to the temporary workers that aren't making that flip, as you discussed. Because if you look at the data, most of the people that are able to make that transition are professionals. They're the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics workers, what people call the STEM workers. but not necessarily the people in the service sector, in the caring sector. And what we look at in the report is that if you look at the research around the world, the people that are most mobile and least likely to stay in an economy that has issues are those STEM workers. So the federal government certainly wants provinces to pursue those STEM workers, but for us we need a long-term end goal, which is not just to have people to work, but people who are going to stay and build families here. So that would be another innovative approach. Likewise, under the provincial nominee stream, recognizing family is not necessarily incongruent with economic elements either. One of the biggest issues for immigrants leaving is that they have to return home to take care of older family that are getting ill, that they end up having to create this chain back. Likewise, what people don't necessarily recognize is that parents and grandparents aren't as old as you might think, especially if, for example, a university student is able to sponsor her parents or grandparents. Their parents or grandparents are probably only about 50 years old. They have about 20 years left in the labor force. And so this is, again, not thinking of it in the usual stance of what's their human capital, how many points do they have, but it's thinking about the long-term need of this region, which is keeping people here and building the region in the long run. And so we recognize that the province has those constraints, but we also recognize that you can think creatively about what the economy means, and that thinking creatively intersects that with social and cultural dimensions as well. And we certainly definitely agree that more research is needed. What we have right now is a just-in-time policy at the federal level. And research in this region is very critical if the region is going to be successful at making the long-term approach to immigration.
I just have a couple of comments and another question as well, but again, I hear all your points, and as you mentioned about the temporary foreign workers and those making the flip tend to be the higher skilled. In our nominee program, we have nominated a select number of NOCCs and Ds, obviously looking at the labor market need and responding to that economic need. And we struggle with that case of increasing lower skilled and semi-skilled workers, given and as we all know, the unemployment rates in our province, the under marginalized groups who are already present, and even immigrants who are already here and are still not working to their full capacity. So looking to expand that C and D even more so with CIC, we tend to get a lot of pushback, especially in where the need is in the smaller regions, and in those smaller regions tend to be those unemployed people. So that catch-22 is something we struggle with. Another thing that's been on our minds that we've been working with CIC with is they've been on with the economic action plan, with CIC's economic action plan. They've been gung-ho about reducing provincial duplication with federal government programming. So a couple of the implications as a result on our end was we were required to tweak our community identified stream, which really points to a lot of the suggestions you're talking to, which in our perspective was a really important stream, and we were encouraged to tweak that into a more regional labor market demand stream to have a more focus on economic and regional labor market need, as opposed to community ties. As a result, that stream's not closed, given the high volume. You all know what that what is. So, but